We're very excited to have you join us today for today's webinar. Our presenter is Mindset VP of Strategic Accounts, Naveen Rokkam. Naveen is a technology leader with a strong passion for both strategy and management. In his role at Mindset, he leads large-scale digital transformation projects. He's passionate about exploring new ways to create remarkable solutions by leveraging the latest technologies. Naveen is also a regular speaker at SAP events, including SAP TechEd, Sapphire, and ASUG. He's put together a fantastic presentation for you today on the topic of SAFe. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Naveen.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Amy. And thanks for everybody who took time in their busy schedule and made time for this webinar. So today's topic is on scalable agile framework and how this framework is an operational approach for leveraging it as the methodology in the user experience, and especially in the S4 area. So what we are going to focus today is primarily on the operational model, why there is a need for SAFe, and how SAFe intertwines with your S4 journey and things like that. A little bit about Mindset. We are based out of Twin Cities and operate across North America with few operations across the globe. Our expertise is essentially in the technology area and bringing the technology solutions to the large scale enterprises and essentially, kind of playing in that mode 2 in the Gartner IT mode 1, mode 2 architecture, and with a simple purpose and mission and goal to make the software at work better for everybody. A little bit in today's agenda. So we will be leading into what is a user experience in Agile, and then we'll talk about SAP Activate methodology. Some of you might have heard about the focus build as a tool from Solution Manager. In past, when I did this session, there's so many questions on how that twines together. So we'll briefly touch about that. And then we'll talk about what is the gap? What is that big gap that we see by having so many methodologies, so many tools from SAP, but when the customers try to go on that S4 journey, the reality of how user experience is ignored and what is that big gap, we'll talk about that. And then we'll lead into a little bit of problem discovery versus problem solving methodologies and how they are significantly helping each other and things like that. And then we'll lead into what is a SAFe methodology and how it can be embraced in this S4 as a journey, especially in the user experience space. We'll also talk about a little bit of a methodology at play in terms of how you can actually adapt it in your organizations, a little bit cookbook on how you can get started, what sort of team structures and things like that. And we'll wrap it up with a little bit of challenges and benefits on doing this versus not doing this, and open it up for questions. During the course of the presentation, if at any point you have questions, feel free to put that in the chat window. Amy will moderate them towards the end of the session. And Amy also has some polls to gather some feedback and make this a little interactive. So if you see a poll question in the chat window, please respond to the same as well. Okay, so user experience in Agile. Whenever we talk about user experience, right, there's a little bit of what is user experience, how is user experience performed, and what sort of methodology does user experience require. And most leaders in IT would agree to the fact that the user experience is something that has to be iterative, it has to be quick, it has to be significantly fast by using a methodology like a product. And that's where it falls in the mode 2 of Gartner IT mode 1 and mode 2 architecture. So if your mode 1 is your core, getting your business process functional as is, mode 2 is your user experience innovation space, where things move quickly, fast, in an agile fashion, and essentially increasing the productivity of the business. And this is a way to represent our Gartner solution here as well, where user experience operates in that agile fashion. And within that space, we essentially do sprints. So we have our sprint planning, our development, and then the deployment activities. And all of that happens in a little bit of a factory kind of a model where things are running on a production line and the team is churning through the incoming spare parts and converting that into an end product. And that's how we encourage people to think about theory applications, and of course, leading with the design thinking methodology and tying the design thinking element of that into the application. So it looks like we have 3 people who voted for this poll question. So This question is aimed to understand a little bit of the audience. And for some of you who are still trying to look on your screen where the poll questions are, it usually pops up like this. So feel free to vote them. If you're having any challenges, just drop your responses in the chat window. Amy can accumulate them later as well. So some of you have migrated to S4, some of you haven't, and some of you are not planning to move, but probably are interested in learning more. So user experience in a nutshell is always in that agile mode. Uh, Now, when you think about user experience, and now you think about S4 as a journey, SAP promotes SAP Activate methodology, which is significantly better. It helps a lot in terms of providing a solution capability. So this is the SAP standard Activate methodology: prepare, explore, realize, and deploy phase. Each of the steps have its own advantages. At the same time, one of the things that you'll probably quickly identify in this slide is this methodology focuses on getting your solution capability ready. And that's essentially what it should be focusing on. How could you look at your business and what SAP solution or templates fit in for your business? And how can you get your solution ready in the SAP core? So this still plays into the core mode one part of your IT, Gartner IT architecture, and a little bit of a focus build. So focus build is a tool which is available in Solution Manager, and many people who are embracing the S4 journey would be eventually interacting with focus build at some point. The way the focus build comes into play is it looks at some of the roles that could exist in your organization because it's a future state, you do not have S4 yet, and then take your business process models and convert that into a role based mechanism. In this particular methodology, using this tool and SAP Activate methodology, you would see that most companies are able to definitely spin up that solution capability by turning on the standard apps and things like that. Again, SAP Activate methodology is also executed in agile fashion, and that's probably a common thread between SAFe and SAP Activate. Both go in agile fashion. And later in the slide, I'll also take an example of how a solution in SAP Activate methodology intertwines with the user experience in SAFe practice. On a broad level, when we look at this, we do have a SAP Activate as a methodology. We have the tool focused well, and companies are turning on applications. But the gap that essentially exists there is people are thinking more from a role based perspective, but less from a user centric approach. And doing the first part of the equation enables a capability in the solution, but it does not essentially provide the greatest and latest user experience. So that is a gap that is really being missed in many of your S4 deployments. I have been interacting with many S4 leaders, and most obvious thing that they would miss in their initial uh, discovery phase is that they do not think about user experience. So, in order to address this user experience transformation journey, there is a little bit of that methodology that has to be embraced. So, we'll talk about the methodology in a second. But before moving on, we do have another problem statement which is challenging IT leaders as well. When we look at the out of the box applications that are available in the HANA system, there are significantly about 10,000 plus apps available. Most applications do a lot of functionality, standard out of the box, like sales order or even a work order, even shipment check-in, things like that, right? So there's a lot of upside by using those apps. But however, it is very imperative that not all 10,000 applications are would be used in an organization. So turning on all the 10,000 apps may or may not allow your users to have all the experience they require. There might be activities in your business process which may not be covered by that particular out of the box application. And also there's a little bit of that confusion, like how should I turn them on? Should I turn them all at once and then allow the users to figure it out? Should we just put them in sandbox, allow them to experiment with it? So all of these questions, right? So essentially, if you look at all of these questions, what it boils down to is there has to be a segregation between identifying your problem statement and solving your problem statement, and then eventually tying that to a methodology. So all these gaps together lead into the content of this presentation today. So this is a hand-drawn solution 101, nothing fancy. This is me just sketching it out there along with some IT leaders. So in our solution 101, one of the things that we observed is on the left hand side, you have 10,000 plus out of the box apps. And the goal is very simple. You would like to identify what that out of the box apps that you have to turn on. In this particular case, let's say it's 400. So how do you identify which 400 apps your final end state of S4 should have out of the 10,000? And what are those missing activities that your business users perform today, which are not captured by this out of the box apps? And what sort of process you would have to embrace to, provide a user experience in that space? So with those outcomes and questions in the mind, when you look at this block diagram, so essentially what it comes down to is it comes down to two segments. One is problem finding and the other is problem solving. So in your finding is where we developed a methodology called the digital discovery, and we'll talk about that in a second here. And I see some of you are not familiar with SAFE, which is a good segue to the topic. Thanks for responding on that poll question. So we do a process where we try to understand the high level end-to-end business flow within an organization. And then we capture the activities and then we identify all the steps. So once all the activities are discovered, and I'm going to flip the next slide quickly here. So within the problem finding, we do this digital discovery phase where we take the end-to-end business activity, and then we identify all the activities that are included in the end-to-end business process. And each activity is done by a persona or a group of people, right? For example, checking a truck in a warehouse. So when a truck is checked into a warehouse, the driver drives into the warehouse. So step one is a driver persona who is driving a truck into the scale. And step two is your shipping clerk who talks to the driver, and then they try to understand what sort of freight order they're trying to carry today. And step three is your loader who loads something into the truck. And step four is your shipping clerk giving the driver some documents signed like e-bill of lading. And step five is driving out of the warehouse. So in a simple end-to-end business process like checking in a truck and loading a truck, you do have a driver, a shipping clerk, a forklift operator interacting. So all of these are different personas and there are different activities performed by them. So as a part of this process, what we encourage the teams to do is we bring them together in an ideation session and we try to craft out this journey map. What are your activities? What are the personas? And then translate that into a swim lane structure where we try to clearly identify what are the significant activities where if you would like to transform your business, what are those areas where you'd like to spend your time, money, and effort? So the byproduct of this discovery phase is a stack ranked personas where you would know where as an organization you would like to transform your experience. So once your discovery phase is completed, and I'm going to flip back to this original block diagram here. So in your discovery phase for the S4 projects, people go through this process of talking end-to-end business processes, identifying your activities, personas, and then stack ranking them. Another common thing which most customers have eventually figured out that they would need is a governance board. So this governance board is kind of a sounding board, and it is comprised of a different group of people. And I'm going to flip to my governance board slide here. The role of this governance board is they review the byproduct of the discovery phase, that is your persona journey map. They look at all the personas and then they will say, I would like to rank my shipping clerk persona as the highest. If I solve this problem, this will yield in X number of dollars, or this is my return on investment, or this is my significantly increased customer experience. So the governance board helps to put that use case together by reviewing the journey map for each persona. And once that stack rank of personas are available, the governance board also goes through a process of approving them and trying to prioritize them for building as a part of the build activity. Our usual recommendation for this governance board is having your business sponsor, your business process owner, your IT governance members, and an innovation champion who acts like the innovation lead. His primary responsibility is disruption, who challenges the status quo and says, you know what, if you do forklift operator versus shipping clerk, you actually have a significantly higher return on investment. So those kind of conversations are brought in by the innovation champion. And finally, you have a program manager or a release train engineer. We'll talk about that in a second here, who would try to make sure all of this action items from the governance board are taken into more meaningful steps. So at this point, we have identified what problem we want to solve, and now we are trying to get into the problem solving phase. So in the problem solving phase, we leverage the design thinking as a methodology. Most of you might have attended multiple mindset webinars. We are very high in design thinking. We do a full blown walk a day in a life, and then we do empathy sessions with the end users, create the persona maps, and then we design low res prototypes which are converted into high res and sent back to the users for feedback. I'm not going to dive detail into the design thinking process as a part of this session. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. But what we essentially have achieved at this point is we have identified the problem statement, we have identified the personas, the governance board has stack ranked for them, and the design thinking team is ready to go and solve the problem. Now, the question is, how does this all come together? It looks very simple on a piece of paper. You have these three blocks, and then we expect 10,000 apps to go through this. But how can this be scaled? How can this be done across multiple work streams, across finance, HR, supply chain, transportation, all of that? And how can this be performed effectively in the scale of a large organization? So now this all tees up to that question on what is our methodology, right? So SAFE is scalable agile framework. It's a methodology, it's an industry methodology out there. And many companies, both SAP and non-SAP, embrace SAFE. And now we'll jump into what SAFE is. On a very high level, if you go into SAFE website, you would see that there are four versions of the methodology. There's an essential version, and there's a large version, large enterprise solution version. There's a portfolio version, and there's a full SAFE. I would usually recommend SAP enterprise companies to start with a large solution version of SAFE. And one of the things that you'll eventually realize is no matter which version you start with, you would eventually end up with a customized version of your own. Just like how Agile and Sprint methodology are there, but every company embraces their custom methodology. This eventually turns into a little bit of a custom safe methodology for your own company. So in this methodology, we're going to spend a few minutes on this slide. In this methodology, what happens is there is a product management team which ensures that everything that is being approved by your governance board from previous step is being prioritized and is being delivered as a part of a bigger program. And then you have your enterprise solution delivery team, which is your solution engineering, solution management, and this is a solution train engineer, or also called as a release train engineer. And then you have multiple product managers and product owners who are interacting in the agile fashion. And there's also the design thinking element to it, where this methodology allows you to have sprints which are exclusively for design thinking, and then they intertwine with your build sprints. The guts of this methodology is program increment planning. During program increment planning, what happens is all the teams come together. You have multiple work streams. Let's say you have 5 work streams with multiple product owners for each work stream. One work stream catering to CRM, one for SCM, another for supply chain, and maybe the other for HR, right? So if all of these work streams are there, each work stream has its own product owner, and then at the beginning of the increment, they all come together and they look forward for about 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever works best for your organization. They look forward for that 8-week period and say, okay, we are going to plan all our activities and work for 8 weeks, which means not only for the work streams, but also the supporting work streams like basis, security, they are also part of the planning. And all the work streams plan their work in 4 sprints. Each sprint is 2 weeks. So the math plays out to be 8 weeks. So the increment is an 8-week duration. You have 4 sprints, and you essentially plan at a feature level, not at a user story level. At a feature level, you would plan the high level backlog and say, work stream A, I'm going to achieve this. Work stream B, I'm going to achieve this. This is my dependency between both the work streams and things like that. The byproduct of that planning, usually the planning goes for about 8 hours. Usually it's a totally effort which is worth spending your time and energy on. The byproduct of the planning is your team has a consolidated vision for 8 weeks. And as a leadership group, you're able to safeguard this team's capacity, this team's priorities for the next 8 weeks. And this also helps your product owners and product managers to plan out the release of the product and also manage the dependencies, the versions, and also manage your stakeholder expectations saying, I'm going to get this application in my second sprint in the first increment, or this is a spillover from my last sprint in the previous increment to the next sprint in the next increment. So those kind of conversations happen, and adding practices like DevOps and things like that makes the whole process seamless. So SAFe in general provides you that mechanism where you do things in increment based approach, again leveraged on your agile fashion sprint methodologies. All the teams come together, and one of the significant advantage of this is by bringing your basis and security teams, you would be positioning your teams for success in a very agile fashion. There is a poll question. Let's see if we have any response on that. Not yet, so we are going to skip that for future. uh, Now let's take an example. So let's talk about what sort of solution can we envision by putting all of this together, right? So we spoke about increments, we spoke about sprints, we spoke about multiple topics like design thinking, solution capability, building them, and we spoke about the governance board. Now, in reality, how do all of them come together? So this is a hypothetical example. Let's say, as an IT leader, you have put together a program increment. And in the first increment, what happens is you have multiple teams. One of your work stream is a design team. So the design team is constantly focused on doing design thinking workshops. Their goal is to produce the design solutions for the problem statements. So what they are tasked with is a certain problem statement. And if you remember our block diagram, we have clearly called out those problem statements as a part of our discovery. So they have certain problem statements and they come up with a low risk or high risk prototype at the end of the sprint. And what happens is whatever solution they came up with in the first week of this sprint, and then they get reviewed by the end users in the second week, and that actually turns out to be your part of your build sprint. So the design work here, in this case, I took an example of shipping clerk. So if sprint one, I'm doing a shipping clerk experience, that becomes the build backlog for my build teams for sprint two. If design sprint two is focusing on forklift operators, that becomes the backlog for sprint three. In that fashion, what we are essentially doing is within an increment, your teams are working in that iterative handshake model, and they're able to not only create an output of design, but they're also able to create an output of building the application. Now, in parallel, your governance board will be reviewing your backlog for next increment. So if you see through that, all of that plays in that cycle where design team is doing first sprint and build team is doing it in the next sprint. Your governance team is already planning for the next increment, and all of that is happening in the context of one big increment. Now we're going to flip back quickly to our original block diagram here. So what we have come up till now is we have a methodology of discovery, we have a methodology of governance, and we have a methodology of design thinking. Now building all of them into that SAFe methodology and putting the bigger umbrella on top of that enables all these teams to work in that iterative fashion and achieve a product. And a quick question could be like, okay, so now we have everything. So what is our process? So your 10,000 apps, when they go through the discovery process, as a byproduct, you would identify what activities are related to you. And for what activities, the governance board will then declare for what activities you have standard out of the box applications. And for what activities, you need to create a custom experience. A standard example is a warehouse dashboard. So if your warehouse managers wants to see a very specific dashboard about how many trucks are coming in, how many forklift operators are working in, so that kind of an experience may not exist as standard out of the box app. And that kind of an experience is very much desired for operational efficiency. So in that case, those experiences become candidates for design thinking. A little bit about various types of design thinking. I know a lot of people always ask me, do we always need 1 week, 2 week, 3 weeks for design thinking? And the answer is usually no. There's always a custom fit version of a design thinking depending on the nature of the problem. If you're only looking at one activity, one particular persona, it's not going to take a week long effort or 2 weeks effort. So we do have multiple flavors within design thinking, small, medium, large, and we can talk more about that as well. But the goal here is you would lead with the design thinking methodology to solve the problem. So that's a little about how the methodology helps in practice to put together, you know, your your journey of S4. Now, probably we're hitting into that challenges, benefits phase, and things like that. One of the most common challenge that you would run into this particular methodology is your solution teams will be working in a different sprint cadence. They could be operating in 3 week sprints or 4 week sprints, or they could even be working in a totally different paradigm. The most common situation that we ran into is the solution teams are following SAP Activate methodology. Again, the underlying is a sprint agile methodology. So they're operating in a 3 week sprint. And then your user experience team, because they want to keep it agile and they want to keep it more in the shorter duration cycles for delivery, they like to operate in 2 week sprints. So there's a difference between that sprint alignment, right? And we'll take a practical example in a second here. So what happens usually is the challenge is the alignment of the user experience product owners with the solution build product owners. And we have experimented multiple variations of this. We have seen people playing both the roles of being a solution team product owner and also user experience team product owner. And they had some remarkable experiences there. And we have seen two different people playing two different roles, and there also we had some good stories. Whichever direction you would take, the crux of it is an open and transparent communication, especially during prioritization of features. That is where the dependencies are called out, and that is how people try to understand how things play between the solution team and the user experience team. And if you're planning to get started with this approach, give yourself the first increment to feel how things go. Usually, the first increment is a learning curve. Usually, these increments run to the order of having like 100 and 150 people across multiple work streams. So if your build team is of size 8 people, including a scrum master, and then you have 10 teams, it's about 80 people. And then you have a basis team, and you also have a security team. And then you talk about bringing your automation team or your testing team into the same increment. So you're looking about 100 plus people, right? And for us who worked in large organizations, we do understand that bringing 100 plus people into a program usually takes time for all of them to embrace it, evolve, and understand it. So usually give yourself about an increment. And one thing that you'll quickly see is, now shifting gears into the benefit side of it, once the team gets into that rhythm of increments in your increment 2, 3, and 4, their velocity goes significantly up. The amount of collaboration that happens between the teams, especially the cross-functional teams and the basis and security versus work streams, it works like a charm. It's significantly high, and people get into the rhythm of collaboration and time. So the team is very much focused on delivering what they committed to. And prioritization also helps that to an extent. So those are some of the things that you'll see as benefits. We'll probably take one quick practical question here. Many times people ask like, hey, what happens if my solution build teams and my user experience teams are working in different sprints? What sort of interaction patterns can we expect? What sort of handover happens? And this is a very practical example, right? Like your S4 team, for example, your S4 finance team who is spinning up the capability of finance might be operating in this fashion, or your S4 supply chain team might be operating in this model. And then you have your user experience team, which is a different work stream, which is trying to push for a user-centric design, trying to push for a user-first approach. Now, how do you align those things? In this particular case, the solution team here is working in 3 week sprint, and then your user experience team is working in 2 week sprint. And of course, the 2 versus 3 never magically lines up, right? So one of the ways to have interaction that we found was successful was let your solution team begin first. If you guys are starting on increment at the same time or plan to doing it at the same time, let your solution team take that first step in their week one or their first increment. And as a part of it, recommend them to identify features. As the solution team works around all these trophies are the features, the legend is here. So encourage them to talk about what features are required. So encourage them to talk about what features could be relevant for user experience team and allow them to flag that. And whatever features they think are related to user experience team would eventually flow into user experience workstream. Now, there will be certain standard out of the box apps, which are like, in order to get this functionality, I definitely need an out of the box app. So that turns out to be a feature for this user experience team. And if this team, while they go through their backlog combing, they find, okay, the user story, the feature is about activating standard apps. Let's do it. They would just go ahead and activate the standard apps. But if there is a custom experience feature that is requested by a build team, then this team goes through the process of doing a design thinking workshop, doing a design review, and then getting into the build fashion. So in this way, what we are looking at is as your S4 capability teams operate in SAP Activate methodology using focused build or whatever tools they would like to, your user experience team works in that safe methodology. And it brings in all the work streams together and they're able to scale within that whole agile framework. And there's a significant benefit of doing this. Again, this is not a replacement for your SAP Activate methodology. This particular methodology has proven success for us when we try to embrace this in the S4 context, especially within the user experience work streams. So at this point, I would like to open it up for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. We did get a few questions on both Q&A and on chat. So on first question is, what is an increment in workstream planning?
Great. So increment usually is defined as the duration of that program, right? So we usually call it program increment planning, PIP. An increment usually is 8 weeks in length. Within an increment, you have 4 sprints. Each sprint is 2 weeks. So you're looking at one increment, 4 sprints, and the team comes together at the beginning of the increment. And they do have certain ceremonies like program increment planning and program increment closure. And every sprint has their sprint reviews, sprint retrospectives, sprint demos, and things like that. So taking your foundational agile methodologies, SAFE provides that overarching increment approach where you're able to solidify your vision not just for 2 weeks, but for 8 weeks.
Perfect. Next question. We are a large SAP organization. Should we adopt SAFE as is or customize it?
That's a good question. I think I probably covered that. So one of the things that you'll see is every company does its own flavor of SAFE. Although SAFE is there as a guiding methodology, you would you would see that your basis team might like to work in waterfall, or your security team might like to work in a different fashion. So each work stream is slightly different, and the way that you would be able to influence them would be slightly different in the context of your organization. Sometimes it also depends on how the organization is structured in terms of engineering teams, platform teams versus product teams, and things like that. So the underlying principles of increments and the concept of release to an engineer or product owners and product managers would be the same, but you might have a little bit more customized flavor of it. And that's where we also help companies to create that custom version of what works better for them, getting them started on that increment journey and making sure that they're positioned for success.
Thank you for that one. Next question. Who all should be engaged in the discovery approach and what is the duration of them?
Great question. So the discovery approach is usually your end users, definitely, and we recommend having an IT governance champion. He does not have to be a functional analyst or a technical person. He's somebody who knows the business process and who could challenge them to an extent. That would be a usual recommendation. End users, IT governance champion, and then uh, we usually recommend having a innovation lead. The reason we recommend doing that is this person keeps an eye open for transformation, also challenges them broadly, like, okay, you guys are doing this paper based, why don't you just do kind of an OCR, or why don't you just have all of this digital? So he helps in identifying some of that use cases as a part of discovery, and then the other person would be your facilitator for the workshop. So that's the mix of people that we have seen to produce a lot of value add in the discovery phase. We have experimented multiple versions of it. There are some great success stories. There are some stories where we had to redo it or we had to learn it. But as we did that over the last 2 years, one thing we observed is this mix of people will help you hash out your business model. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be like too long, right? So our shortest one was in 4 hours, where everybody came together in our app house. We started sketching out things. We started creating that journey map, and we started creating the business process integration maps and things like that. Our longest one was for like 3.5 days. So yeah, that's about the duration and the team structure there.
Perfect. So it looks like we have a follow-up question from one you asked before. When you say velocity improves from increment to increment, what type of improvement do you see? I.e., 10% more story points from sprint one to sprint two, 10% over a quarter, any benchmarks?
That's a good question. Uh, by But the face of the question, I would assume you guys are already doing agile, which is great, awesome, great start on that. The usual benchmark that we have seen, we do have a comparison between increment to increment, and every increment we have seen about 10 to 20% growth without adding any additional team members. The same team members are able to increase their velocity. Within the sprints, we usually tend not to compare them. The reason we try to do it is we are focused on success and failure of an increment, right? There will be certain situations where things might slip out from increment sprint one to sprint two, or or the teams have an opportunity to close dependencies earlier, so teams can get started earlier. So there's a little bit of that flexibility within that increment. So the usual recommendation is to compare your velocity at the end of each increment with the previous increment. And one of the things that we also try to do is, because we have an increment planning, at the end of the increment, we have a gut estimate on the overall increment. For example, let's say 10 work streams, each work stream delivering 30 story points. You have about 300 story points delivered by the overall group in the increment. So when the increment planning is happening, we also like to challenge the teams by pushing a little more on their plate, but not too much that they sign up for like 500 story points, right? We don't allow that to happen, because we know by doing that you're already positioning them for failure. But if they're only around 290, 300, we challenge them to take about another 5 to 10%. That's a little bit of flexibility that we also try to provide to the teams. And that's a challenging status quo and things like that.
Great, thank you. Next question. Assuming you do safe implementation or set up services where we'll execute with teams, but you'll help with designs, rules, expectations of the process, how long does it take to set up? And that
Great
actually
question.
relates, there was a second question I think relates to it, which was, how do I get started to safe? So it seems like you probably answer both those at the same time.
Perfect. Awesome. So any methodology, right? Whether it's agile, safe, activate, or any methodology, it is a journey, and it can only be effective as much as the teams embrace it. So there is always that learning curve where teams have to be educated. And in order to do that, we do take a servant leadership approach. So we try to bring all the work streams. We try to work with the IT leaders and request their top down push on that. At the same time, we also, during our learning approach, we try to empower the team so that they can embrace from a bottom up push as well. So usually about a week is what we say is an educational time frame, where we come, we do some mock-up, program increment plannings. We try to showcase that as a mock drill, try to make sure that the teams are understanding what's happening, allow them to question, allow them to figure out their own sweet spot, And as a byproduct of that 1 week mock drill, what happens is you would identify your own flavor of your safe, right? And then we put together a program plan along with your IT leaders, and then we say, hey, we think these are the seats in your leadership team, these are the seats in your operational team, these are the seats in your build team. Now let's put together a sample team. So initially, the thumb rule is always just start with one work stream and then add on two more work streams, three more work streams. So by the time you're hitting into your second and third increment, you'll see that it's very easy for you to be like a 10 plus work stream model. And as a part of that advisory engagement, we do challenge status quo many times. If something can be done differently, if something can be improved, we bring that feedback and allow the team to see the value in that. So there's a lot of experimentation as well. And if you're trying to spin this up, I would say about a month is what you're planning, kicking off, and all of that activities would take like. But once you put that together, you would see the value pretty quickly.
I think that's the end of the questions, Naveen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. I really enjoyed some of the questions. Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate that. Yep. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And my contact details are on the slide. And Amy will also probably send you the PowerPoint deck as well. Feel free to send me a note. I'm very passionate about talking more into this. This kind of ideated, or this idea originated some of the pain points that we have seen at multiple customers, and that's how we started putting this together, and we started experimenting with this, and we started seeing a lot of benefit and value in this. So very happy to share about this approach and the learnings, and yeah, we would be happy to take it forward from there.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Naveen. And as Naveen mentioned, please do reach out if you have any additional questions or if you're interested in receiving the recording of today's webinar. Also, if you're interested in scheduling any time to talk one-on-one with Naveen regarding any projects that you have in mind. Thanks again for joining us, and please visit the Mindset website on the events page to sign up for future webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you.